Releasing in 2024, the Silent Hill 2 remake had the storage and processing capabilities that the original 2001 game couldn't fathom. With so much room for enhanced graphics, music, sound design, voice acting, and motion capture in the remake, I wondered how they would try to honor the unsettling feeling of a low poly man running through the fog with limited foley and an iconic soundtrack blaring in our ears. While the original relies heavily on its soundtrack for creating unease, the remake forces us to strain our ear in silence for the clicks of monsters and hiccups of static, creating its suspense out of something different from the original. The first few seconds of the Silent Hill 2 remake told me everything I wanted to hear. Let's watch it together. This time, the bathroom scene begins in pure darkness, hinting for us to walk into this game ears first, eyes second. Where the original scene had only the introspective synth music with intermittent lines from James, the remake relies entirely on Foley. It begins with the running sink being twisted shut, unseen hands shaking droplets into the sink, and a low, resonant thrum building into a squeal before abruptly cutting and revealing our first visual of the game: James's hands reflected in the mirror. A strong wind distantly screams outside. Water continues to dribble down the drain as James's jacket swishes as he twists his shaking hands into his sight. Only when the camera moves to his stubbled chin and mouth do we hear his shaky gasp and nervous swallow. His wet hands rub together, reminding me of the squelching of future decaying, rotten levels in the game. It's like we're joining James as he wakes up, eyes opening and reacquainting himself with his body, bit by bit, new to himself and us, new to the game. As soon as his gaze meets his own reflection in the mirror, the synth music starts, throwing us into the game it is promised to be, this time accompanied by orchestral strings coloring the song with a hint of hope. To me, this scene is James burying the truth of his wife's death, its timeline, and their relationship's final standing deep into his psyche. When he meets the gaze of his reflection, his darker side, he refuses to acknowledge the truth. Mirrors are something you can shatter in this game for a reason. This refusal is why he was called to Silent Hill. It's why the game's iconic music plays as he looks in the mirror. This rebirth is something that we will watch unravel like a body turning inside out, like pulling a cozy tick forcibly out of its host, sometimes decapitating it in the process. The original 2001 game already did a wonderful job molding our minds into the emotion it wants us to feel. Like that one Polaroid says, shape forces the mind, I think sound and line delivery do the same. In both the original and remake, once James leaves the truth in that worn bathroom with its unsettling music, we then hear a beautiful and nostalgic guitar loop play as he takes on this new, hopeful persona, leaning against the railing overlooking Toluca Lake. This is the James we have now. One as hopeful as the guitar we hear, with something darker lurking just underneath. James's walk to the graveyard in search of Silent Hill is the first time he comes into contact with the fog. I'm going to play snippets of the two versions. I ask you to keep in mind how much James can see in front of him, what the camera does, what sound effects are used, and how the soundtrack changes as James moves forward. And now, the remake. Both versions feel uneasy for different reasons. The original limits our visibility significantly, and the fog itself feels in motion. We hear synth playing over loud gusts of wind, which, coupled with the lively fog rushing past, make the place feel alive. Less than subtle animalistic clips play loudly and abruptly from different parts of the brush, and the alternating camera looking from said brush makes it feel like whatever's growling is also watching us. As we approach the save point, the synth shifts and increases in volume, bouncing mechanically back and forth as James approaches the well with what becomes our save point, the red square. In the remake, the fog is more realistic. It's smooth, blurring the outlines of what's there. It's calm, and the occasional quiet gust adds to the silent tranquility. It wants us to listen closely for something to break the peace like a neck. The underlying soundscape we get isn't as low as the originals. Rather than deep and resonant, it feels undulating and mobile, inhaling with a higher, soft squeal and exhaling with a lower, steady synth. To make up for these tampered bits, we get snapping twigs, rustling leaves, falling gravel. We get one of those funny growls, but it's also toned down. We don't get the suspicious camera, the extremely limited view, and cacophony of growls, but through toned-down subtlety, we know something's there. I also want to point out a smaller detail that makes this scene for me: the squelching footsteps. The original has a dry crunch like walking on cereal. The remake recognizes the recent rain, the moisture in the ground, and James's shoes on the path sound disgusting. If I close my eyes, it's easy to imagine viscera instead of mud. The same goes for James's hands in the bathroom. These uncomfortable, wet sounds are, in my opinion, very intentional in creating our unease. Through comparing the two games, we can see the tools at which the different versions excel. The original relies on its visuals, like monster design and environment, its music and its story, all in all making that delicious Silent Hill vibe. The remake, on the other hand, showcases its own updated gameplay, revamped music, intricate soundscapes and effects, improved voice acting, and detailed facial expressions and body language through motion capture. For this video, I'm, for the most part, limiting myself to applauding some particular uses of audio in the remake. Even the bathroom scene tells us that the actors will be giving us a feast in this remake. This time, we get subtle gasps, nervous swallows, heavy sighs, frequent audio elements that were out of scope for the original. I think these little vocal elements, like James's disappointed grunt upon finding a locked door, and his frequent throat clear out, push us further into our empathy for the characters and further into the game. Additionally, rendered scenes that felt otherworldly due to the original's aloof line delivery now feel more grounded, especially coupled with the actor's motion capture. I could show you a comparison of the graveyard scenes from the original and the remake, but I love hearing Laura be mean to James, so let's use a different clip from the beginning of West South Vale. Here's the original.
You! It was you, wasn't it? You're the one who stepped on my hand.
I don't know. Maybe I did.
What's a little girl like you doing here anyway?
Huh? Are you blind or something?
What's that letter?
None of your business. You didn't love Mary anyway.
Wait! How do you know Mary's name?
And here's the remake.
Hey, it was you, wasn't it? You're the one who stepped on my hand.
Maybe I did.
What's a little girl like you doing here anyway?
I don't know. What's a big dum-dum like you doing here anyway?
Hey, that's not very nice. Didn't your parents teach you any manners? What you got there?
None of your business. You didn't love Mary anyway.
What? Hey, wait! How do you know her name?
The original uses the same thrumming soundtrack as the rest of the map with no additional music, making the cutscene just as uneasy as the rest of the map. The remake doesn't use the original's thrumming soundtrack, instead keeping the town more quiet. When James approaches Laura, we're met with soft rain overlain with soft piano as Laura leans over her letter deep in thought. James's voice actor does a great job of depicting a disgruntled adult talking to a problem child. He's petty, and it's amazing, and I love the change to "How do you know her name?" from a frustrated shout to a contemplative question. Laura's voice actor leans less into problem child than the original, but embraces rightfully calling him a dum-dum.
What's a big dum-dum like you doing here anyway?
The changes to the line delivery, the space added between lines to add body language and room to breathe, and the minor script changes make it feel less surreal and more sympathetic to Laura. Now, I'm deviating from audio, but I love how the two scenes differ in Laura's positioning. The original scene has her take a fraction of the screen, and her face is indiscernible. We just see a kid sitting on a ledge in a strange town with strange music. The remake scene feels more like it's starting from Laura's perspective, using darker tones, emphasizing the soft melancholic rain and piano, demonstrating her grief and confusion over Mary. The camera's starting position is significantly closer to her and tilted more into her perspective rather than that of James. Only then do we shift to the same distant kid on a ledge frame of the original as James approaches. Then we see the game's voice acting shine, with a fun addition.
What's a big dum-dum like you doing here anyway?
Okay, yes, I really liked that addition. But I really wanted to point out that when James asks, "Didn't your parents teach you any manners?" Laura pulls Mary's letter closer to herself in silence and curls in on herself, again from this closer Laura-centric camera perspective, hinting that she might not have parents, and instead considers Mary as a parental figure. This is seconded by Mary's own letter saying that she considered Laura as her own daughter, and even wanted to adopt her. Again, not audio, but something really well done that I needed to highlight. And one final bit of voice acting that really adds to the game: James's fighting sounds. He's out of his depth, he's desperate, and maybe he's really into that one final kick. Though, yes, we also get this one too. I'll let y'all be the judge of that one. Now, having heard and seen how the remake utilizes revamped voice acting and motion capture to pull us further into the game, I like to focus more on the sound design choices made in the remake. I'm going to start with an over-analysis of a specific scene, and then I'll go over some other sound design choices and bits. First, I want to point out a scene that didn't really need anything changed to the sound design and gameplay sequence. When we finish Toluca Prison in the original and remake, we eventually take the plunge by pulling the rope in the remake and jumping down the hole in the original into the prison morgue. The original relays tension in this room through text, adding that James might have seen the body move and how horrible the rotting flesh smells. The remake adds an eerie screech to the morgue's closing doors before the flashlight flickers on a corpse that seemingly lets out a horribly ragged gasp. Through another set of doors is another body on a gurney and a hole. A rancid, dark, endless hole. The remake swaps James's written dialogue for panicked breathing as he steels himself for the jump. Eventually falling into the inky black. He rises back to his feet in the dark, coughs, and presses forward into a virtually unchanged scene from the original. Let's listen. What made this scene really stick with me was the sharp contrast in the quiet of the morgue beforehand, where you're straining your ears for the rustling of cloth, anticipating a dead body to rise, to this blaring, almost alarm-like sound repeating over and over in this pure darkness as you walk down a hallway towards yet another hole, down another hallway, and finally into what feels like a cage as its doors screech shut, trapping you where you stand, becoming the only thing louder than the siren as it then sparks and shudders down further and further into Angela's apartment complex. When we open the door to the hallway, listen to the shift. We're back to the deep, underwater drone that digs into our brains, overlain with whispers seeping from the passing doors. The original's hallway reused the labyrinth's wavering soundtrack, immediately taking you to the room with Angela and her monster. Before we go any further, I'd like to add a warning. This next sequence includes a fight with a monster that embodies one of the characters' history with SA. The remake delves more into the visual and audio representations of this trauma than the original, which is a lot of what I will be discussing. If you'd like to skip this part, please skip to the time shown on the screen. In the original game, the monster appears in the room, screams into the camera, and then the music abruptly changes to a tinny mechanical track as he follows you around the brightly lit room to be beaten to a pulp. Now with that in mind, let's watch the remake's introduction.
Daddy!
When we meet Angela's monster in the remake, I'll call it AD for short, we're now in the dark as the door creaks open. Angela shouts, and he attacks. He's big, he's loud, and he's heavy, bulldozing himself onto James until they both break through the wall, initiating the original's mechanical track. AD's roar shakes the camera and stuns James as he curls in onto himself, hands over his ears. The monster takes up the height of the hallway, swinging his frame and embedding himself in the wall like it's putty, as the hallways crumble under his weight. When the monster walks by a light source, it flickers, sometimes bursting as AD carelessly smashes into it. After dealing some damage, we're rewarded with a moment of tense respite as we search for the monster. The mechanical fight music falls away and is replaced with a new high-pitched buzz ebbing in and out, accompanied by a steady, deep thud reminiscent of a heartbeat. The wallpaper's falling, beams are showing, wall corners are missing. Most of the lamps don't work anymore. We hear Angela's frightened gasps to our left and right as soon as she comes into sight before fleeing, as if we're the threat she's running from, which feels disturbing. Rounding the corner to pick up some rifle rounds triggers a painting to fall, and the monster's scream to ring out, interrupting the relatively quiet break and adding to the tension. Some of the rooms shake with the unseen monster's movement, raining down debris as we hear either another roar or a person's very faint whimpering. The soundtrack only quiets if we enter Angela's safe room, but it's still there. After dealing more damage, we find the first of 3 TVs that play distorted recordings of Angela's father's verbal abuse. Shattering them, preferably with the pipe as it's much more satisfying, floods our ears with squealing sparks and with more walls collapsing under the monster as James covers his ears in pain before the monster stumbles into view. I'm still unsure if it's the monster's roar or the act of breaking the TV that causes James to cover his ears this time, since he doesn't cover his ears again when the monster lets out a more isolated roar. It could just be an unintentional mismatch, though. Now, a quick aside about the TVs. I had always associated TVs in Silent Hill with James, but Angela herself throws a TV on her monster even in the original, and now they appear in the remake's fight with Abstract Daddy. It's interesting to me, however, that James is the one breaking the TVs rather than Angela, and that James silencing Angela's father by shattering the TVs summons Abstract Daddy. Breaking the TV feels like it could be taken as a refusal to hear something so disturbing, wishing to avoid it. However, breaking the TV could also be viewed as a channel for anger to slam into the symbol of Angela's abuse, silencing a monster whose whole presentation thus far has been about screaming, breaking, and smashing, only to be silenced and shattered by a stranger summoning it in anger. Part of me prefers Angela to smash the TVs, but she's rightfully scared. She is relying on instinct, running and hiding until the threat is gone. And besides, James is an expert at smashing TVs at this point in the game. This next sequence is when I think brand new choices in visuals and sound design in the remake become very apparent, their impact in creating tension and discomfort amplified by the knowledge of what the monster represents. They take the disgusting, invasive visuals of the original's boss fight room, and they expand on them. The visuals and soundscape change from wallpaper, wood, and carpet to flesh, iron, and machinery. The wallpaper, now entirely peeled away, reveals flexing skin as the hallways strain to breathe. The sounds of pistons and gears huffing, hissing, and churning stumble around the carnage of an ever-collapsing apartment. Everything sounds like cracking, breaking, thumping, sparking, hissing, wheezing, and thudding. Until you enter the final room, blocked off by a comically large and rusted industrial fan. Once you've shot your last bullet into the monster's form, Angela kicks the monster and throws a TV on it, silencing it for good.
Angela.
This whole fight is a very uncomfortable and scary sequence designed to make anybody feel small. James battled his way through a fraction of what Angela went through, and it threw him on the ground and made him curl in on himself and cover his ears. All of these new elements that the remake added, including the apartment maze, the collapsing walls, the flickering and bursting lights, the recordings, the TVs, the safe room, following Angela's fleeing form, the breathing walls, the pistons and fans, all contain audio elements that expertly push us further into the fight's horror. Now, having all of that said, there are some more sound design choices in the remake that I'd like to highlight. The original Silent Hill 2 tends to have a loud soundtrack with a handful of reused monster sounds. You're either listening for a not-so-subtle or for your noticeable radio static to indicate danger nearby. Due to the clunky tank control and unreliable fighting, most people would just run past the monsters that behave more like set pieces. Granted, there are portions in the original that don't have a loud soundtrack, but it's done solely to stand in contrast to the other levels' music. The remake has a wider range of mobility for its sound design. It can control how the soundtrack changes depending on smaller areas. It can utilize a plethora of different monster noises of different lengths and volumes, along with a wider range of radioactivity to include even the tiniest little blip that could spell danger. This, coupled with the visually darker game, The remake's flashlight, in my opinion, feels like it runs on a single Duracell, forced me to tell my roommates to shh as I tried to determine if that creak I just heard was a monster or the soundtrack. Because that's something they do in the remake. They add red herring noises in the soundtrack itself to raise your guard and put your hair on end. One of my roommates that I hushed told me that the listen for monster dynamic, and even the monsters clicking, reminds him of The Last of Us, and I agree. I was no longer sprinting past monsters with a top-down camera view in a hallway. I was always peering over James's shoulder, listening for what could be just around the corner, only to get jump scared by a silent mannequin. They got me so many times. Another section that plays with volume and monster sound is Toluca Prison, specifically the prison cell blocks and the yard. Both the remake and the original have the cell blocks filled to the brim with soundscaping, radio, and monster noises. The original sounds like this. Monsters stay on the ground, and our industrial flashlight effectively illuminates all walking or crawling monsters. And in the remake, in the midst of all that noise, we meet for the first time these. The cell block's corridor yawns upwards into an inky darkness that now contains hidden, crawling spider legs. When that light timer shuts off, and James is plunged into darkness, the spiders come back, and they chatter. Again, I'm listening for their crawling, clicking, and if they choose to attack, their screeching. And if you haven't cleared the area of monsters, it sounds like a fever dream orchestra that makes me want to shit my pants as James sprints through the cells towards the new unexplored area called the yard and throws open the gates, and all the sounds stop, and so does everything ahead of him. It's dark. Immediately, I felt unsafe again. This stark contrast from the noisy, monster-infested cell block to the silent, pitch-black yard had me running back into the cell block for safety and pausing the game to make a cup of tea and fight the nausea. And, of course, it gets worse. In the midst of the squelching footsteps, we get this. I heard that sound and immediately turned the camera towards it. My brain fabricated a rule that if I had the camera pointing at the unseen creature, it would remain quiet and still. Otherwise, it shuffles towards me. I was entirely convinced of a game dynamic that wasn't there because I had just been saturated with the rule of listening for a monster that's just out of sight and is very real and very tangible and will pummel you to death. Instead, I was just chasing after a sound that was programmed to play every now and then. I hated that yard so much. I was honestly surprised to learn that the original's prison yard is basically exactly the same with the immediate silence, red herring footsteps, and free camera. The remake just had to give James some nasty wet footsteps and some revamped spatial audio to make the yard all the more terrible. All of this is to say, all the detailed, intentional layers of sound design aimed at getting us to listen closely for danger pair well with the improved fighting style and over-the-shoulder camera to make this an entirely new gaming experience based on suspense. Now, let's go on to discuss some smaller details I really appreciated. Throughout the remake, we see different mannequins that make different sounds. We have the mannequins at the beginning of the game that click and when hurt make the same otherworldly animalistic sound as the original. We have the crawling mannequin that clicks and screeches. And towards the end of the game, we get mannequins that click and emit a feminine voice tinted with what seems to be either desperation or pleasure. It seems like throughout the game, the mannequins are finding their voice boxes. A part of James, the one being revealed throughout the game, is violent. And very recently, James was deathly violent towards a woman. The mannequins and nurses are thought to be partly designed after James's building lust over the years that Mary was battling with illness. The mannequins are traditionally feminine, and even Pyramid Head, James's guilt manifested, violently attacks these legs. For me, the mannequins feel more tied to Mary than any monster. They are something feminine that James can kill again, beating down the thoughts James had of wishing he could have his sexual partner back while his wife struggled with terminal disease. Each attack on a mannequin is a reminder of the violence against his wife, and the more truth we uncover, the more the mannequins gain a familiar pained voice. There's other audio reminders of James's murder throughout the game, like a slight gasp that can be heard in certain areas pertaining to Mary, thought to be her gasp of surprise upon James murdering her. This is a quick detail to cover, but it was one of the other reasons why I knew I'd be making this video. Hospital bed sheets are a prominent motif in Silent Hill 2, even becoming a game mechanism to indicate interactable objects in the remake. I'm a nosy player, so I threw James into every corner I could just to sniff around for any extra dialogue or crumbs. One of these corners was right up against one of those walls of bed sheets in the intro, which I was delighted to find sounds like this. They made sound effects specifically for nosy people like me, embedded into a map boundary most people probably don't even approach. The fact that this wall boundary is made of a material which is very important in the game makes that detail all the more special. The last audio element I want to point out is what made the original so memorable for me in the first place. The really, really weird soundtrack for the levels. One moment we're jamming to alt-rock, and the next we're listening to an air raid. The soundtrack itself follows dream logic much like the game, suiting the environment's needs without sticking to any particular style. The remake only expands on this even further, adding to the original's track with new beautiful instrumental layers that pluck at my emotions even more. I'd honestly recommend putting on headphones and listening through the remake soundtrack after playing the game. As much as I'd love to talk more about the game's sound design, I have to stop myself so I can actually finish this video. I already rewrote and added more than I should have. There's just so many details the remake highlights and introduces to immerse us further into the original story and to shed a new light onto it. So naturally it became the only thing I could think of or talk about or write about. So here we are. And if you're planning on playing the remake or watching a playthrough, I definitely recommend it, and I'd recommend doing so with headphones or with really quiet roommates.